Breaking news from Washington, and this time it's not coming from the usual suspects. For the first time in his presidency, Donald Trump is facing open rebellion, not from Democrats, not from the media, but from his own Republican Party. And this isn't background chatter or anonymous sources. This is senators casting votes, drawing constitutional lines, and saying no to a president who's never accepted that word in his life. What's driving this unprecedented revolt? Why are GOP lawmakers suddenly willing to cross the man who still commands their base? And what does it mean when emergency declarations, war powers, and institutional breakdown all collide at once? Stay with me, because what's unfolding right now isn't just another political fight. It's a test of whether American power answers to law or to one man's instincts. And the answer will reshape Washington long after Trump is gone. Here's what just happened. Republican senators joined Democrats to advance a war powers resolution specifically designed to limit President Trump's ability to launch unilateral military action. The vote wasn't close. It wasn't symbolic. It was a direct legislative check on executive authority. And Trump's response? Profanity-laced phone calls, threats of political destruction, and public rage aimed squarely at members of his own party. Senator Susan Collins reportedly received one of those calls. The language was harsh, the message clear. Loyalty is mandatory, dissent is betrayal. But this time, the intimidation didn't work. Because what Republicans are finally confronting isn't a policy disagreement, it's an existential question about power itself. And here's why this moment is so dangerous. Trump has been publicly, repeatedly suggesting military action against Greenland, not as a joke, not as negotiation theater, but as a real option on the table. And Greenland isn't some neutral territory. It's part of Denmark. Denmark is a NATO ally. NATO operates on collective defense, which means any military move against that territory doesn't just risk embarrassment. It risks triggering Article 5, putting the United States in potential conflict with Europe. Senator Chris Murphy laid this out in stark terms. We are talking about a scenario where American military force could be used against an ally's territory, fundamentally threatening the Atlantic alliance that has anchored Western security for 75 years. And the fact that lawmakers have to explain this publicly shows how far the conversation has drifted from normal. And it gets worse, because while this war powers fight escalates, Trump has simultaneously declared a national emergency over Venezuelan oil assets, invoking extraordinary executive authority to centralize control and bypass congressional debate. The administration frames it as protecting American energy security. But the timeline is murky, the benefits uncertain, and the primary winners would be multinational corporations, not everyday Americans. Behind all of this, there's another pressure building. Lawmakers like Senator Sheldon Whitehouse are now openly questioning why promised document disclosures have stalled, why Inspector General reviews are delayed, and why transparency commitments haven't matched reality. These aren't accusations, they're red flags, and red flags demand answers. So we're watching three crises collide: war powers rebellion, emergency declaration escalation, and accountability failures. And Republicans are caught in the middle, forced to choose between party loyalty and institutional survival. Let's break down what's really happening here, because the mechanics matter. The War Powers Act exists for exactly this reason, to prevent presidents from dragging the country into conflict without congressional authorization. It's not a partisan tool. It's a constitutional safeguard passed in 1973 after decades of unchecked executive military expansion. And when Trump started floating military options regarding Greenland, lawmakers didn't hear strategy, they heard alarm bells. Because Greenland is sovereign Danish territory, home to critical U.S. military installations, including Thule Air Base, a key node in North American missile defense. Any military threat against it doesn't just violate international law. It shatters NATO credibility and signals to adversaries that American alliances are negotiable. And here's the critical data point. NATO's Article 5 has been invoked exactly once, after 9/11, when Europe stood with America. If the US were perceived as threatening a member state, that unity collapses. European defense ministers have already expressed private concern. Allied intelligence cooperation, which depends on trust, would be jeopardized. And Russia, China, and Iran would seize the propaganda victory instantly. But Trump doesn't process geopolitics through alliances or treaties. He processes it like real estate: territory, leverage, and dominance. And that mindset applied to military power is what terrifies his own party. Because once a president frames force as an option, the machinery activates. Contingency plans get drafted, allies start hedging, and Congress either reasserts itself or becomes irrelevant. That's why the War Powers Resolution wasn't symbolic, it was an emergency brake. And the vote wasn't about undermining Trump politically. It was about preserving institutional authority before it erodes completely. And Trump's reaction, rage, profanity, personal threats, proves exactly why the check was necessary. Because leaders who see constitutional limits as personal insults are precisely the ones who need those limits most. Now layer in the national emergency declaration over Venezuelan oil. On paper, it sounds strategic. Secure energy assets, reduce dependence on hostile regimes, protect American interests. But look closer. Venezuela's oil infrastructure is in ruins after years of mismanagement and sanctions. Rebuilding would take a decade and tens of billions in investment. The primary beneficiaries wouldn't be American consumers. They'd be multinational energy giants with the capital and expertise to extract and refine heavy crude. And here's the timing problem. This emergency was declared not during an acute crisis, but during a domestic political firestorm over war powers and oversight. Which raises the obvious question, is this about energy security, or is it about changing the subject and consolidating executive authority? Because emergencies do something powerful. They centralize decision-making, bypass normal legislative processes, and allow presidents to act unilaterally. And Trump has leaned into emergency powers repeatedly. Border wall funding, COVID responses, trade restrictions, and now this. Each time, the threshold for what qualifies as an emergency gets lower and the scope of presidential action gets wider. And Republicans are finally noticing the pattern. Because today's emergency precedent becomes tomorrow's normal. And once you normalize unilateral executive power, it doesn't disappear when your party loses the White House. It gets inherited by whoever comes next. Now add the accountability layer. Trump campaigned on transparency, particularly regarding long classified documents. He promised rapid disclosure, suggested personal involvement, and framed it as a signature issue. But months later, the results don't match the rhetoric. Timelines have slipped, reviews have stretched, and lawmakers are now asking why. Senator Whitehouse specifically cited Inspector General compliance concerns and unanswered statutory deadlines. He's not alleging conspiracy, he's identifying process failure. And process failures matter because they reveal whether commitments were genuine or performative. And here's where it connects. Every time oversight tightens, Trump escalates the external drama, war threats get louder, emergency declarations multiply, the news cycle floods, and the underlying accountability questions get drowned out by spectacle. It's not subtle, it's strategy. The same strategy he's used for decades: flood the zone, change the subject, dominate the narrative, and exhaust the opposition. But Congress isn't an audience that gets bored and moves on. It's a co-equal branch with subpoena power, budget authority, and institutional memory. And some Republicans are remembering that they have power too, not just to support Trump, but to check him. And that realization is what's driving this revolt. Not ideology, not partisan gain, but the cold recognition that if they don't defend institutional limits now, those limits won't exist later. And history doesn't grade politicians on loyalty to leaders. It grades them on whether they preserved the system when it was under pressure. And right now, the pressure is coming from inside the White House. So who gets hurt when power concentrates and institutions weaken? Let's walk through the real-world impacts, because this isn't abstract constitutional theory, it's concrete risk. American families and workers are watching their president threaten military action against allies while inflation remains stubbornly high and cost of living continues to squeeze household budgets. The no new wars promise that attracted millions of voters is colliding with rhetoric that sounds increasingly like war planning. And voters don't separate foreign policy from kitchen table economics. They see instability abroad as a threat to stability at home. If markets panic over NATO fractures or energy disruptions, retirement accounts take the hit. If emergency powers bypass Congress repeatedly, voters lose their voice in how power is used. Consider a middle-class family in Pennsylvania. They voted for Trump hoping for economic security and restrained foreign policy. Now they're reading about Greenland invasions and Venezuelan oil emergencies while their grocery bills haven't dropped and their wages haven't risen. The cognitive dissonance is real, and it's fueling disillusionment even among the base. Small businesses depend on stability, predictable trade relationships, reliable supply chains, and consistent policy. But when the US president threatens military action against allied territory, uncertainty spikes. Business owners can't plan investments when they don't know if NATO will fracture or if emergency declarations will redirect economic priorities overnight. And emergency powers, once normalized, create unpredictable regulatory environments where executive orders can reshape entire sectors without legislative debate. Take a small manufacturing firm in Ohio that exports to Europe. If NATO credibility collapses, European partners start hedging, diversifying supply chains away from American vendors. The damage isn't immediate. It's a slow erosion of trust that costs contracts, jobs, and revenue over months and years. Large corporations are caught in a different trap. Energy companies might benefit from Venezuelan asset access, but only if infrastructure investments pencil out over decades, and only if political stability holds. Defense contractors watch NATO tensions with alarm because alliance fractures threaten the collective security architecture that drives procurement budgets. Financial institutions see emergency power precedents and worry about rule of law predictability, which is foundational to investment decisions. Stock markets have already shown sensitivity to Trump's more erratic announcements. When war rhetoric spikes, volatility follows. When emergency declarations bypass normal channels, institutional investors price in governance risk, and that risk premium gets passed down to consumers through higher costs of capital. International partners are recalibrating in real time. European defense ministers are privately discussing what NATO means if the US threatens a member state. Canadian officials are watching Greenland rhetoric and reassessing Arctic security cooperation. Asian allies are asking whether American commitments are reliable if Atlantic alliances fray. And adversaries are taking notes. Russia has already amplified Trump's Greenland comments in state media, framing it as proof of American imperialism and NATO hypocrisy. China is watching to see if the US will alienate its own allies, creating openings for Beijing to expand influence in Europe. Iran sees emergency power escalation and calculates that Trump might overreach into conflicts he can't control. And here's the ripple effect nobody's talking about enough: institutional trust. When Congress has to invoke war powers acts against a president, when emergency declarations become routine, when oversight fails to produce transparency, public faith in governance erodes. And that erosion is bipartisan. Liberals distrust executive overreach, conservatives distrust unaccountable power, and the middle just sees chaos. Expert warnings are piling up. Constitutional scholars are describing this moment as a stress test of checks and balances. Former national security officials are expressing alarm about the casualness of military threats. Economists are warning that policy unpredictability is a hidden tax on growth. And the consequences aren't hypothetical anymore. They're unfolding in real time, in votes, in market reactions, in allied capitals, and in living rooms across America where voters are asking the same question: is this what we voted for? Let's hear what those closest to these issues are actually saying. Senator Chris Murphy didn't mince words. Military action against Greenland would mean military action against a NATO ally, fundamentally undermining the alliance structure that has kept the peace in Europe for 3/4 of a century. He called it unthinkable and warned that even entertaining such options damages American credibility. Senator Sheldon Whitehouse focused on the procedural breakdowns. We have statutory timelines, we have inspector general mandates, and we have an administration that appears more interested in spectacle than compliance. He's not alleging crimes, he's pointing out that process matters, and when process fails, accountability dies. Constitutional law experts are raising deeper concerns. When emergency powers become normalized, when war rhetoric becomes casual, and when congressional authority gets sidelined repeatedly, you're not just bending rules, you're establishing precedents. And precedents don't belong to one president. They become tools for every future administration. Former defense officials have privately expressed alarm at how military threats are being deployed as negotiating tactics. Because once you threaten force, allies and adversaries alike have to plan for the possibility you'll follow through. And that planning has costs: repositioned assets, altered strategies, hedged commitments. So what are the consequences, short and long term? In the next 30-90 days, expect this Republican revolt to intensify. The War Powers Resolution vote was procedural, but it signals willingness to check executive authority. More oversight requests are coming on emergency declarations, on document disclosures, on inspector general findings. Trump will escalate rhetoric, frame dissent as sabotage, and push harder on loyalty tests. But some Republicans have already crossed the line, and crossing back gets harder every time. Markets will remain volatile as policy unpredictability persists. NATO will quietly begin contingency planning for scenarios where U.S. commitments are less reliable. And voters will continue processing whether the presidency they're watching matches the promises that were made. In the 6-12-month range, the real test comes. Can institutions hold? Can Congress maintain oversight discipline when Trump floods the zone with new crises? Can courts adjudicate emergency power challenges without becoming partisan battlegrounds? And can voters distinguish between spectacle and governance when both are delivered at maximum volume? If Republican resistance holds, we could see a rebalancing, executive power checked, congressional authority reasserted, and norms reinforced. If it collapses under pressure, we're looking at a presidency that operates beyond institutional limits, setting precedents that will haunt us for decades. And internationally, the damage may already be done. Allied trust, once broken, takes years to rebuild. And adversaries who see weakness in American alliances will exploit it immediately and ruthlessly. This isn't a partisan prediction, it's a structural reality. Power unchecked doesn't correct itself. It requires resistance. And right now, that resistance is being tested in real time. Here's what you need to remember from everything we just covered. 1. Republicans are revolting against Trump not out of disloyalty, but out of alarm, because war powers, emergency declarations, and accountability failures are colliding all at once. 2. The fight over military threats to Greenland isn't symbolic. It's a constitutional crisis over whether presidents can threaten allies without consequence. And 3. Process matters. When disclosures stall, when oversight fails, and when emergencies become routine, democracy doesn't collapse all at once. It erodes until someone finally says no. The question in front of us isn't whether Trump wins the next news cycle. It's whether the rules that govern power are still stronger than the people who hold it. And that answer is being written right now in Senate votes, in oversight requests, and in the choices Republicans make when loyalty collides with responsibility. So here's my question for you. When institutions are tested, do you want spectacle or stability? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'm reading everyone. If you want to stay informed on stories the mainstream media won't fully cover, make sure you're subscribed and hit the bell icon, because this story isn't over. It's just getting started. And remember this, democracy doesn't protect itself. It relies on people willing to defend it when it's inconvenient, uncomfortable, and politically risky. And that defense is happening right now. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.